Father-in-law's secret. At 3 in the middle of the night, I heard some noises coming from father-in-law's room. The sound wasn't very loud, but it was enough to reach the living room. Curious, I stood at the door of father-in-law's room and gently knocked twice, asking, "Dad, what's wrong? Aren't you asleep yet?" Father-in-law suddenly stopped making noise. Then came his somewhat hoarse voice, "It's nothing, just a bit thirsty." Accidentally knocked over the cup. I heard what he said and didn't think much of it, replying, "Oh, how about I bring you another cup of warm water?" Father-in-law immediately said anxiously, "And no need, you go to sleep. I've already had some." Seeing father-in-law refuse, I didn't ask further and turned to go back inside to continue sleeping. But just as I took a couple of steps, I heard some noise coming from father-in-law's room, along with a faint female voice. At that moment, I felt something was off and planned to turn back to ask him, but then I thought, it's so late, maybe he's just scrolling on his phone or video chatting with a friend. After thinking it over, I decided not to bother my father-in-law and went straight back to my room to sleep. My husband had just gotten up to use the bathroom. He noticed me staring out toward the living room and asked curiously, "What are you doing, looking around like that?" I leaned close to my husband and whispered, "It sounds like there's some movement in Dad's room," and I even heard a woman's voice. "Honey, do you think Dad might be hiding a woman in his room?" My husband was amused by what I said. He pressed my forehead gently and laughed, "Don't meddle in things that aren't your business. Even if there is a woman, it's normal. Isn't Dad single? It's good for him to have someone." I think what my husband said makes sense. After all, my father-in-law has been divorced for many years, and my mother-in-law remarried a few years ago. It's perfectly normal for my father-in-law to want to remarry as well. However, I still feel a bit worried and confused. I always feel like my father-in-law is hiding something from us, not wanting us to know. If my father-in-law really has found someone, just like my husband said, that's a good thing. There's no need to keep it a secret. My husband and I would naturally fully support and approve of it. But why does my father-in-law never mention to us that he has found someone? The more I thought about it, the more I felt something was off. Gong Gong is usually so honest and timid. There's no way he would secretly bring his partner back and hide them in the room. Around 5 in the morning, my husband suddenly woke me up, calling me several times. I rubbed my sleepy eyes and asked him drowsily, "What's wrong? The alarm for work hasn't gone off yet." My husband said, "Don't sleep anymore. It seems like my dad is really in trouble." Upon hearing that something was wrong with my father-in-law, I suddenly became alert and sat up, asking my husband, "What's going on?" My husband looked a bit embarrassed and said, "I just got up to go to the bathroom and really heard some noise coming from my dad's room, and there was a woman's voice too." It really confirmed my suspicion. When I got up in the middle of the night, I felt something was off, but I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just sounds from the video. But now that my husband heard it too, there must really be a woman hiding in my father-in-law's room. My husband and I exchanged a glance, both feeling that something about this was a bit suspicious. I said, "What should we do now? Should we pretend we don't know, or should we ask Dad about that woman? We can't keep being so suspicious all the time, nor can we just pretend not to hear it." My husband thought for a moment, then nodded and said, "We should ask Dad. If we don't get to the bottom of this, knowing Dad's nature, he probably won't bring it up on his own. We can't let him keep hiding it from us." But directly asking about this situation feels quite awkward and embarrassing, especially with my father-in-law. He's sensitive and has never talked to us about that woman, probably because he's shy and embarrassed to mention it. I discussed it with my husband, and he also felt troubled, not knowing what to do. I suddenly remembered a joke I saw online before, where someone used a camera to secretly film their housekeeper and ended up capturing an unbelievable scene. I had a sudden idea and said to my husband, "How about we install a camera in Dad's room? That way, we can find out what's really going on." The idea was somewhat risky, but my husband did not object after hearing it. Instead, he thought it was a good plan. So the two of us quickly agreed and decided to buy a camera. The next evening after work, my husband and I sneaked into my father-in-law's room. Taking advantage of the fact that he was playing chess at the neighbor's house, we installed the camera in the corner above the desk. After installing it, my husband and I hurried back to the kitchen to make dinner, pretending as if nothing had happened. Since installing the camera in my father-in-law's room, my husband and I have been quietly waiting to see what would happen. But for several consecutive days, everything was peaceful and uneventful. Father-in-law had a normal routine, drinking his bedtime milk every day and then lying down to sleep. We waited for half a month until that weekend evening, when my husband and I were taking a walk in the neighborhood after dinner, and the camera captured a shocking scene. We saw father-in-law intimately holding the hand of a stylishly dressed, middle-aged woman, quietly leading her into his own room. My husband and I were both stunned at the time. We never expected something like this to actually happen. From the video, it can be seen that the woman has a pretty good face shape and figure. My husband and I could hardly believe our eyes. It seems that my father-in-law has really found his other half. With solid evidence of this matter, whether my father-in-law admits it or not, my husband and I have decided to talk to him. The next day, after my father-in-law quietly sent the woman away, my husband and I sat on the living room sofa waiting for him. After my father-in-law returned to the room, he was taken aback when he saw the two of us and nervously asked, "Why aren't you two at work?" I smiled and nodded at my father-in-law. "Dad, it's Sunday today, no need to work. Did you forget?" My father-in-law responded with an "oh," his face showing little expression, and he quietly and nervously walked back to his room. My husband quickly nudged me, urging me to keep asking while there was still time. I glared at him. "Why don't you ask yourself? You always make me take the lead in everything." My husband looked at me affectionately. "You're better at talking." "Fine," I sighed helplessly, cleared my throat, and called out to my father-in-law, who was about to go back to his room. "Dad, don't go in yet, we have something to discuss with you." My father-in-law paused in his steps, turned around, and looked at me with a puzzled expression. His tone was calm. "What is it? Just say it." I thought for a moment, then mustered the courage to ask, "Dad, did you bring a woman home to stay overnight last night?" My father-in-law was taken aback by my question, his expression very awkward. He seemed unprepared for such a direct inquiry and didn't know how to respond for a moment. I took the opportunity to press further. "Dad, you've been divorced for many years, and we all understand that you want to find a companion. But you can't keep hiding it forever. If you've found someone, of course we'll support you. And if you have any difficulties and need our help, just say the word." As I said this, I sneaked a glance at my husband, who was also staring intently at my father-in-law, waiting for his response. The father-in-law was silent for a moment. Seeing that the matter could no longer be kept secret, he finally spoke. "Actually, I have been thinking about finding a companion. But as you know, at my age, almost 60, an old man like me, it's not easy to find a good match. Even if I want to, others might not be willing. Besides, I never really considered remarrying, mainly because I was worried about meeting someone unreliable. Over the past 6 months, I have indeed been seeing someone, thinking I would spend some time with her before telling you." Hearing this, my husband and I exchanged a glance, surprised that the father-in-law had actually found a suitable partner. I asked excitedly, "So, when do you plan to let us meet her?" The father-in-law seemed a bit hesitant upon hearing this. After a pause, he said, "I think it's better to wait until I've spent more time with her. When the time is right, I'll bring her home for a meal and introduce her to you all." My husband and I were both a bit excited after hearing this, but my father-in-law refused to say who the woman was, not mentioning her age or occupation, as if he wanted to hide something. However, we all understood in our hearts that he was actually afraid we wouldn't accept his new partner. So I quickly comforted my father-in-law, saying, "Dad, don't worry, we won't oppose it. You're already at such an age, wanting a companion is only natural. As long as you feel it's right, that's all that matters." Hearing this, a relieved smile appeared on my father-in-law's face. He said emotionally, "Actually, I'm quite touched that you care about me so much. I was just afraid you would have posted if you knew, so I never said anything before." My husband and I quickly comforted my father-in-law, expressing our complete understanding of his feelings and sincerely hoping that he could find his own happiness. Through this conversation, the barriers between my father-in-law and us seemed to have diminished significantly. Although my father-in-law still refused to reveal specific information about that woman, we all understood that he had already taken us as his confidants, willing to share his joys and sorrows with us. My husband and I also decided that no matter who that woman is, we would definitely respect my father-in-law's choice and do our best to support him. After all, my father-in-law has already lived more than half of his life. Being able to find a suitable partner is such a happy thing. We truly feel happy for him. However, things did not go as smoothly as we had expected. A month later, my father-in-law discovered the cameras we had installed in his room and angrily shouted at us, "Shameless! How could you do such a thing to me?" My father-in-law was trembling with anger. He never imagined that my husband and I would do something like this behind his back. But we did this with no other intentions, just wanting to find out the situation between my father-in-law and that woman. Besides, since our last conversation, my husband and I haven't watched the videos from my father-in-law's room anymore. After being yelled at a few times by my father-in-law, I couldn't help but roll my eyes at my husband. "Didn't I tell you to take the camera away earlier? Why didn't you take it?" My husband scratched the back of his head a little embarrassedly. "Sorry, honey, I forgot." I glared at my husband. Now this is trouble. If my father-in-law finds out, he definitely won't easily forgive us for doing such a despicable thing. Looking back now, I really regret it. I shouldn't have installed a camera in my father-in-law's room. If he has someone, let him be. Everyone has their own privacy, so why dig it up like this? In the evening, I cooked a few of my father-in-law's favorite dishes, hoping to apologize and earn his forgiveness. But my father-in-law shut himself in his room and wouldn't come out, not eating a single bite. I had no choice but to carry the food and prepare to bring it to his room. Carefully carrying the meal, I walked to my father-in-law's room door, gently knocked, and found the door wasn't fully closed, so I pushed it open directly. Hearing the noise, my father-in-law turned around and glared at me angrily, almost shouting, "Get out." I was so frightened that my hand trembled, nearly spilling the food on the floor. Seeing my father-in-law in a bad mood, I could only stand dumbfounded at the door, not daring to enter. I noticed that the room was somewhat dark, with only a small desk lamp emitting a faint light. I followed the faint light and saw that my father-in-law was sitting by the bedside, with his back to me, his shoulders trembling slightly. At that moment, I somewhat realized that my father-in-law might be crying. My heart ached, and I felt that I had really been too harsh. Why did I have to do such a thing? In that instant, I suddenly felt a pang of sympathy for my father-in-law. Thinking of his loneliness and solitude over the years, I felt increasingly uneasy inside. I quickly closed the door quietly and returned to the room to lie down beside my husband. "Honey, I think Dad seems to be crying," I whispered to my husband. "Really? He's not a child. Why would he cry?" my husband replied softly. I pinched my husband's ear and said angrily, "It's because we installed a camera in his room, and it made him so upset he cried." My husband clicked his tongue dismissively and shook his head at me, saying, "It's nothing. Don't overthink it. My dad is just temporarily overwhelmed. After a few days, this will pass and he won't hold it against us." Early the next morning, after my husband and I got up, we went to my father-in-law's room and found that he had already gone out. A few days later, my husband and I decided to sincerely apologize to my father-in-law, hoping he could forgive what we had done before. While my father-in-law was watching TV in the living room, my husband and I quickly sat beside him and said, "Dad, we're sorry. We shouldn't have installed a camera in your room without telling you. We violated your privacy." When my father-in-law heard this, he was momentarily stunned, then sighed and said, "Actually, I have long known what you two were up to. The reason I lost my temper that day wasn't because you installed the cameras, but because you didn't trust me." My husband and I felt a bit ashamed after hearing this, realizing that our behavior had indeed been excessive. I said with guilt, "Dad, we know we were wrong. We did this because we care about you so much, worried that you might encounter unreliable people or be deceived by women outside." My father-in-law smiled after hearing this and said, "I know you're worried about me, but I have my own judgment and know what I'm doing. That woman is very kind and considerate. Maybe I will marry her." Hearing my father-in-law say this, both my husband and I were a bit surprised. We didn't expect that he and that woman had already reached the point of discussing marriage. I asked curiously, "Dad, when do you plan to bring her home? We really want to meet her." After hearing this, my father-in-law still seemed hesitant. He was silent for a moment and then said, "Let's wait a little longer. Things between her and me haven't been completely settled yet." Every time it comes to this, my father-in-law always makes excuses, which is especially suspicious. It wasn't until one day, when he accidentally let it slip while eating, that we learned the woman was a part-time massage worker at a barbershop, supporting herself through massage. This wasn't the main issue. The worst part was that the woman had a very irregular lifestyle. Due to her work, she had to give massages to clients late at night, and all her clients were men. Her social circle was also quite chaotic. After my husband and I learned about her basic situation, we were especially worried about my father-in-law being with her. Especially my husband. He felt that the woman was only after my father-in-law's money and didn't truly like him. So, behind my husband's and father-in-law's backs, I began to privately investigate the background of that woman and discovered that she was not as despicable as we had imagined. In fact, she is a very resilient woman, divorced for many years, raising her child alone. To earn more money, she works hard in the store for more than 10 hours, sometimes even 20 hours a day. After learning this, I felt a bit sorry for that woman and grew to admire my father-in-law even more. My father-in-law did not despise her because of her family situation or work, but instead embraced and cared for her with his love. I told my husband about the situation, but he didn't believe me. He thought I was foolish, deceived by that woman's appearance. My husband even strongly opposed my father-in-law being with that woman. He shouted at him angrily, "Dad, can you stop thinking like this? What is there about that woman worth you sacrificing for? If this gets out, I would be embarrassed for you." My father-in-law was provoked by my husband's words, his veins bulging with anger. He yelled at my husband a few times, "Get lost, get lost. My affairs are none of your business." The father and son were at odds over this matter, and I felt helpless, not knowing who I should try to persuade was the right choice. That night, my father-in-law was drinking alone on the balcony. I was a bit worried, so I went over and said to him, "Dad, I have always known that you are a kind, responsible, and dependable person. If you are determined to be with that woman, I want to make my stance clear. I will not oppose it, and I will also support you in helping her financially." Hearing this, my father-in-law was very touched. He reassured me that he was not acting on a whim and would carefully consider the matter, not making any rash decisions. On this matter, we each hold our own opinions. Actually, the one who suffers the most in this matter is the father-in-law. I think my husband's idea is a bit too impulsive. No matter how dissatisfied he is, he shouldn't have a direct conflict with his father. Everyone has the right to pursue happiness and their own judgment. As children, we should respect our parents' decisions, give them care and support, rather than excessively interfering in their lives. After I conveyed my thoughts to my husband, although he was still somewhat unwilling and dissatisfied, he still felt that what I said made sense. From that day on, my husband and father-in-law never had a conflict over this matter again. The whole family often went out for a walk together on weekends or went to a restaurant for a big meal, and the relationships between us greatly improved. As for the matter between my father-in-law and that woman, my husband and I no longer said anything about it. One night, my husband and I were watching TV when my father-in-law suddenly came over and showed us a passbook, saying, "This is the savings I've accumulated over the years, and I want to leave it to you." At that moment, my husband and I were both stunned. We never expected my father-in-law to suddenly give us such a large sum of money. I quickly refused. "Dad, what are you doing? We don't want your money, you keep it yourself. Aren't you going to marry that woman? You should keep some money on you for use." "This isn't money I'm using to bribe you," my father-in-law joked. "I know in my heart that you all are filial to me. I'm giving you this money not for you to spend recklessly, but for emergencies. This old body of mine won't be needing much money anymore." Hearing my father-in-law say this, I felt a bit choked up inside. My husband also had red eyes, but said nothing. Father-in-law wanted to prove that the woman was not after his money. They were together because they loved each other. Since then, whenever father-in-law brought that woman home at night, my husband and I would return to our own room early and wouldn't even dare to go to the bathroom at midnight, fearing to disturb them. We know that with such a loving father supporting us from behind, we should cherish everything we have now even more. The most important thing right now is to carefully protect my father-in-law's happiness and joy. No matter how things develop afterward, I hope my father-in-law can have a wonderful life in his later years.